Hello everyone, as always I'm Vlad and I know how to shoot. Recently many of you have asked me for clarification on what is known in the firearms world as the SIG scandal, for lack of other terms. Lately all the influencers in the field are talking about this company, but the Italian public has been a bit isolated from this matter. So here I am to explain what's happening. Now I don't know how much in everyday life you follow, perhaps on social media, firearm companies. Lately, SIG out of nowhere made a post that many found quite bizarre. It talked about the truth of the P320, that the P320 has no issues. It can't fire unless the trigger is pressed. And all those who say otherwise are anti-gun, anti-SIG, and it's propaganda against them. Now tell me how many firearm companies have ever had to make such a statement out of the blue? In the last 45 years of Glock's existence, has Glock ever had to publicly defend itself that our guns are safe and do not fire unless the trigger is pressed? Let's start understanding where the problem is. This post, which among other things a total failure from the image point of view of Ms. Sauer, has reignited the fire of doubts around the company. Ms. Sauer, as you know, in recent years has been able to obtain several important American military contracts. The new Army rifle, for example, the new American Army rifle, the SIG MCX. And more notably, they replaced the good old Beretta M9 with the new pistols, the M17 and the M18. Which are simply a military version, as adopted by the Army, of their SIG P320. There are already many doubts about the procedures of this adoption, like exactly how the SIG was chosen. When I talked about it in a specific video, if you want to delve deeper, you can click it here on the top right. However, the focus of what we are dealing with today is not so much the military adoption and any scandals behind the military adoption. It's that the SIG P320 has an obvious problem. And I want to tell you something very important. I want to clarify, because I'm not trying to say that the P320 or the SIG are crap. Many weapons, especially at the beginning of production, have historically had many problems. If I think, for example, of the most widespread weapon in the world, the Kalashnikov program was about to be cancelled. Many had production problems during the early stages. The very famous Beretta 92, which later became the M9 in the American Army, had a ton of problems. Initially structural, for example, the trolleys broke, the closing blocks, problems that have essentially been solved over time. It's important to say one thing: Beretta has never blatantly lied to people's faces, saying that there have never been such problems. And it's all an invention of the anti-gun. What really pissed off the firearms community is that SIG with this post is lying to people's faces. There are tons of evidence, in fact, where the P320 fired without the trigger being pressed. It fired falling to the ground. It fired hitting somewhere. It fired completely out of nowhere, inside a person's holster. And I'm not talking about one or two isolated cases. I'm talking about reports from the Army, the Air Force, the American Marines. I'm talking about multiple police departments that have had this problem and have withdrawn them from service. Several of these incidents have been filmed, for example, by body cams or security cameras. I would like to put some segments or articles or reports, but there is really so much stuff that I really wouldn't know where to start. So the fig that makes fun of us, us gun lovers, us legal gun owners, pisses off a lot of people. And their defense of this situation of this post is quite strange. First of all, this post essentially denies that there was ever a problem. It's a shame that a few years ago the same SIG somewhat admitted or did not admit that there is a problem and made a voluntary recall. That if you want to send us your guns, we will fix them. If you want, we don't admit there's a problem, but just to be safe, if you want to send them to us, an insane cop-out. But the moment a company has to or wants to recall the weapons to the factory to make modifications, there's a problem. And let's be clear, this is not a new thing. It has happened and continues to happen in the world of firearms. I'll give you a comparison. If a company produces 100,000 smartphones, of which 10 are defective, for example, after a while they don't want to turn on anymore. It's not a big problem. In the production line, there may have been some quality control issues, problems with the quality of materials, and many other things. However, when a mechanical object as dangerous and delicate in its context of use as a firearm has defects, it's a problem. Even if only 10 out of 100,000 malfunction and fire randomly without the trigger being pressed, we have a problem. The firearms quality control on firearms necessarily has to be held to a very high standard. They are very dangerous objects for the user who may have to carry the weapon with them, but they are also objects that must be able to function in the event of an emergency, infallibly. Ms. Sauer on their website very proudly lists cases made against them, lawsuits made against them, that have been archived, presenting it as proof that even the American justice system confirms the fact that the P320 is the best pistol ever made on Earth. However, a careful analysis of these cases reveals that SIG has very good lawyers, engineers. For instance, one archived case is presented as a victory in SIG, but perhaps it's slightly exaggerated if we go to read the final report of the case. The jury recognized that the weapon, the SIG P320 of a person who was injured, fired on its own while in its holster. However, the case was archived because it was a civil lawsuit for damages. And it's like saying the injured person wasn't able to prove that SIG at the time of the incident knew about these problems. In black and white, it's written that the weapon fired by itself. However, the reason for requesting compensation is not valid. It's in a sense a legal technicality, and many other such cases have essentially been archived thanks to legal technicalities. And there's a trick, let's say a legal technicality, that is used quite regularly by SIG in its lawsuits, the so-called Doebert standard. Now, when your gun fires on its own and you sue SIG Sauer in the United States of America, you have to prove in front of a jury, in front of the judge, that the weapon actually fired on its own. How do you do this? You need an expert, you need a specialist to certify this. Now, the double standard is a key analysis for the judge and jury to understand if the testimony of an expert is admissible in court. This standard was created in the 90s actually with the idea of admitting as many testimonies as possible. Because the standard, let's say before how experts were admitted, essentially for their reputation. But this created situations where perhaps a very prepared person, expert in their field, who however did not have a strong public reputation, perhaps because they were a shy person who avoided lawsuits, who did not expose themselves to the public world. Their testimony, even if they were the top expert, would not have been considered valid. In short, this old system tended to reward a bit the experts, a bit showy in quotes. While with the new Doebert standard, they wanted to give an opportunity also to those experts who perhaps could have a completely contrary opinion, who were not so showy. There were requirements, such as having tested in the laboratory the theory on which an expertise is based, having had publications in scientific journals concerning that field. Let me give you an example. How can I, for example, assert that a surgeon is a good expert in court? Let's say there is a lawsuit about a wrong operation on the lungs. Then I take a surgeon who is an expert, perhaps in lung surgery. He has had publications in scientific journals. He has done work related to this type of surgery. He is an expert and admissible. Regardless of the previous standard, where the only method of judgment was how the judge perceived this person's reputation, perhaps he was a very shy and little-known surgeon, and there was no one to testify for him, for his professionalism. In this way, the facts are made clear. However, this is a double-edged sword that SIG has used very well. When ballistic experts, for example, would come forward to testify and say, look, indeed, the SIG P320 fired on its own, SIG's lawyers would point out that his testimony is not valid because, For example, he did not test SIG P320S in a lab, did not test a large sample, did not publish scientific papers on, for example, P320S that fire on their own or the circumstances in which guns fire on their own. Most, therefore, of the expert testimonies under this standard were considered invalid. And so, for this reason, many of the cases were dismissed. Now, I repeat, SIG presents them as great successes on their website. But if we go to read the why of these things, we discover technicalities. And there's also something to add. Many other cases are still open, and some of them are going badly for SIG. We'll see how they end up. But what is the technical problem with the weapon? Again, to give the company some credit, many weapons have problems at the start of production. And since the quality standard is so high for this type of technology, sometimes even just a few cases of defective parts from a missed quality check can create big problems. The SIG P320 was essentially built around the requirements of the American Army. The American Army, with the adoption of what would become the M17 and M18, had quite specific requirements regarding the so-called modularity and weight of the weapon. To achieve this goal, SIG, like many other companies, had to seek creative solutions, and this is a good thing. Often progress is dictated by the need to find new solutions. For many of their parts, they used a particular construction technique called metal injection molding. Now, we would need the good Professor Bognardi to explain a little better the metallurgical issues on the mini parts, but in very simple words. Essentially, to lighten everything and cut costs, the SIG P320 makes extensive use of these parts. Now, very precise steel parts are normally obtained by milling. That is, I have a block of steel. And with a special tool, I go to remove the steel around it, thus obtaining, after a series of processes, the shape I want. One might think of things like casting, literally melting the steel and putting it in a mold. However, the steel obtained by casting is often too heavy and too brittle for such use. You can get very thin and small walls, well, it's suitable for very large pieces. The first thing that comes to mind is the classic fountain, the big nose as it is called in Rome, made of cast iron. For fusion is not good for obtaining small pieces of metal. And here comes the metal injection molding. The metal injection molding is a kind of, let's call it, fusion or non-fusion. In very simple terms, a powder of the metal you want to use is used, mixed with the binding agent. This mixture is compressed into a shape, and then, after a series of chemical and thermal processes, this binding agent. Usually a polymer is extracted from this material, so what remains is a very precise shape because, I repeat, obtained by pressing, injecting, that is, injection molding. Literally, this compound leaves me with the finished metal compound, which is much more resistant, much more precise than an equivalent shape obtained by fusion. You can make very small and very thin pieces with this technique, which cost much less than a process done by milling. Parts made with the MIMSI technique have become very widespread in recent years. Recently, as you may recall, I was at Internationale Waffenausstellung, the Nuremberg Fair, the largest arms fair in Europe. And there were many small companies that had their own stand offering firearm manufacturers the construction of parts with this technique. I was very surprised, so to speak, because there were really so many. Metal injection molding is a bit of a novelty in firearms, a construction method that has become very widespread in the last 10 years. There's a big but. The big but is the major problem for everyone, the gun manufacturers, the quality control. You see, the moment I go to mill a piece, there are always defects in the dimensions, in the construction tolerances. However, with traditional machining, it is relatively easy to control these dimensions. In the process of producing parts in metal injection molding, the first injection of this compound leaves the piece a little bit larger than it is. And during the subsequent machining, during a subsequent heat treatment, to remove the binding agent that I just discussed, This part shrinks, and this shrinking of this part is a somewhat delicate process, and a slight error can lead to differences in dimensions. Metal injection molding works great when I need to produce a lot of parts that don't require high tolerances or have wider tolerances. But the moment the sear tooth that holds the striker and the striker itself are made with this technique, even a small error in dimensions can mean that in some situations the striker can disengage. And this has been found to be the biggest flaw in the P320. People who know much more than me, who have analyzed these weapons, the components of these weapons, or even the lawsuits that have been made, they have often noticed strange marks or even breaks right on the trigger tooth. Even if it's just 10 pistols out of 100,000, it's still too much for an industry that requires such a high standard. SIG Sauer with the P320 has made a big bet to take a technological step forward. And let's be clear, if I were in their shoes, I probably would have tried it too. It's a new technique that allows me to drastically cut costs, being able to make a weapon that's cheaper and lighter. Even in the 40th, sheet metal was the new technology, which, so to speak, lightened firearms and made them less expensive. Even sheet metal at the beginning had big problems. However, brave companies and engineers who have always tried to develop new techniques to work on sheet metal have ensured that sheet metal technology has made giant strides. Milled weapons are now rarely seen. They were all made with sheet metal during the Cold War. It's clear that metal injection molding, from many points of view, represents the future for certain parts. SIG probably took a step a bit too far, and I repeat, it happens. It happened to Kalashnikov, it happened to the R15m16, it happened to Labretta M9. However, the big difference is that here the evidence is being denied. Do you think it was wrong that SIG made this post? After so many YouTuber videos, people who made fun of them in the comments, they thought it best to do the smartest thing. Another post worse than the first one. And while the gun community was almost forgetting the P320 issue, now everyone is talking about it. Here I am doing the same. The rabbit hole is much deeper than I managed to tell you today. I had already linked in my community tab a very interesting video, unfortunately in English, so for those who do not speak it, I recommend activating the subtitles. At least, but it's a video that goes deep into the rabbit hole of this scandal, and many recent scandals actually that involve SIG, like the fact that the owner was convicted of a weapons trafficking offense in Germany in 2019, a whole lot of pretty strange stuff. So I strongly recommend you to go deeper. I'll put it here in the description. I also hope in the future to be able to bring you a P320 series given the problems it's having. Personally, at this moment, I wouldn't trust the weapon. Even though the problems are relatively few, in the large mass of pistols produced, they are definitely too many. I repeat, Glock or Beretta have never had to publicly say that our weapon doesn't fire on its own. It's not true that they fire on their own. Do you know why? Because in the Glock and Beretta, they fire on their own? Do with this information what you will. That's all from me for today. Sir, please don't sue me because I don't have any money to give you. And as always, see you next time. Thanks to everyone.